Greetings and welcome to Mount Olympus. I am Hercules Invictus, and tonight I welcome you to THEOSOPHIA, Esoteric Studies. Our guest host is Lynne Salomon Miceli from the ARE, and today we are going to delve into visions of Atlantis. Greetings, Lynne. How are you?
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. It's really nice to be here. And tonight, our guest is Michael Flem, who is the author of Visions of Atlantis, Reclaiming Our Lost Ancient Legacy. Michael is a researcher and adjunct professor of history and philosophy, who actually just came from teaching a class. He's a columnist for New Dawn magazine and a book reviewer for Publishers Weekly. And he's a scuba diver and a guitar player. And he lives in Mexico, which is where he's joining us from. Visions of Atlantis is his second book of history. The first one was called The Spectre of Reason, and it was about the Enlightenment and sort of the myths we have about the Enlightenment. So welcome, Michael. It's wonderful for you to be here.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Lynne, for the nice introduction. And yeah, I appreciate the invite.
Well, what inspired you to write about Atlantis?
You know, I had just been seeing a lot of people from all different fields kind of talking over each other, be it archaeologists, geologists, anthropologists, clairvoyants, and all kind of writing in their own fields to a kind of very specific technical audience. And, you know, one of the things I studied was in graduate school, my master's degree is in intellectual history. And I wanted to show people, look, let's look at the bigger picture here, because all of you are kind of looking at this from a very myopic viewpoint. And it's such a great, you know, subject to do a kind of intellectual history on, which is to say, let's look at how this idea has evolved over centuries, even millennia, in this case, 2 millennia. The story has been around for, and maybe shed light on some of the ways this different information corroborates other information. And then at the same time, show readers the science behind clairvoyance. It was a nice opportunity to, you know, learn a lot about that myself. Read a lot of books on remote viewing, a lot of biographies on Edgar Cayce and testimonies from people who knew him. And I wanted to show people not just, look, this is what Edgar Cayce said, take his word for it, but how did he do this? What was the process? Who were the witnesses? What things did he find that we can prove? And why should we listen to what he had to say about this other subject, which I had not seen a lot of people do. You know, if you buy a, you know, let's say book of Edgar Cayce readings on Atlantis, of course, you're already familiar with his work, which is great. And there are a lot of those, but there weren't too many general introductions to the process of, say, hypnagogic trance, or the process of, in other cases that I cited, you know, remote viewing or clairaudience, or, you know, Rudolf Steiner's methods of meditation and what he thought might be a better way to view these extremely remote time periods for which we have very little concrete, let's say, evidence in the same way we might about ancient Greece or ancient Rome or things like that, things that people can wrap their mind around.
Since you've already started talking about Edgar Cayce, I've learned that there actually are some people out there who don't know who Cayce is, which I think is astonishing. But just to give a very brief explanation, Edgar Cayce was an American mystic and psychic, born in 1877 and died in 1945. And in his lifetime, he gave over 14,000 readings that were taken down by a stenographer. And these readings covered issues having to do with health, reincarnation. They talked about Atlantis and other ancient cultures, about the afterlife, meditation, dreams, and much, much more. So Cayce, we're going to be drawing a lot on Cayce tonight. Your book actually discusses Atlantis from a lot of sources, which is interesting. It starts with Plato, which is where most people first, that's the first source most people would know about. And then it talks about a dweller on two planets and other sources, but it draws heavily on Casey. And so we're going to focus on Casey tonight because Hercules asked us to present Casey's story.
Sure.
So how did the information about Atlantis come through in the Casey readings?
Well, it came through. I believe the first time it was ever mentioned was in, I think, 1923, kind of incidentally during a quite routine past life reading. And a woman, I believe it was a woman getting a past life reading, and the description came up of the Atlantean experience. And he frequently used this. You know, let's say Lynne went in for a reading in the 1920s. She might have had a incarnation in, you know, Fort Dearborn, you know, 19th century Chicago. She might have had an incarnation in Rome, and then out of kind of nowhere, he would say, and then in the Atlantean experience during the third destruction or the first destruction or the second destruction. And it wasn't really until about 10 years later when people started to realize, A, that he was accurate in his medical diagnoses and accurate in his, you know, helping people find oil deposits and things like this, because a lot of people used him for archaeological finds, surveys and things like this. Geologists used to work with Edgar Casey. Amelia Earhart's husband, for example, did a reading with Casey. And it wasn't until about 1932 that a group of people sat down with him for a kind of marathon session specifically about that topic. And thank God they did, because we got so much information from that one reading. I probably cite that reading, you know, 25 times in the book because it's just so detailed. And, you know, for those who aren't familiar, Casey would sit down on a couch in his home office or sometimes in a hotel or at a client's house and go into a self-induced hypnagogic trance, which is a near-death coma, essentially. Heart rate slows, skin gets very cold, and then he would be ready for questions. And whether it was him or a source speaking through him, of course, that's open for interpretation. But what's important is that everything he said was, you know, dictated by a stenographer, Gladys Davis, who, thank God, saved all 14,000 plus transcripts so we can read it. So you don't have to take our word for it. You can read what the question was, the time, the date, who was present. And, you know, later on in the ARE, you can read testimonies of people who can attest to him diagnosing and saving their child's life or curing somebody of an incurable, you know, paralysis through a kind of rarefied collection of herbs and ointments and therapies. And, you know, and even the American Medical Association, which, you know, Casey faced the full force of that early 1920s, 30s Rockefeller turn against holistic medicine. They even credit him, believe it or not, as the founder of holistic naturopathic medicine, because he understood that the body works as a system, that you can't just treat one thing, that it's a system of circulation, elimination, stress, movement, exercise. And, you know, we take that for granted today, but 100 years ago, that was not obvious to most people. So that's a kind of little mini bio background of who this man was.
So now you referred to the fact that there were three destructions of Atlantis, and that is different from what Plato describes Atlantis as a large island west of the Straits of Gibraltar that was destroyed in a single night.
That's right.
Casey says Atlantis was originally a much larger continent, and there were three events.
That's right. That's right.
About that?
Yeah, and in fact, I actually find that Plato's account and Casey's account are directly in line. It's just that Plato was only aware of the third and final destruction. Because the date Casey gives for the third destruction is well within plus or minus a few hundred years of that final window. I think also that, you know, when you look at the timeline for Edgar Cayce's story of Atlantis, it's so much longer than most people are used to thinking when it comes to like continuity of civilizations. You know, you think of some of the longest enduring civilizations in recorded history, like the Ottoman Empire, which lasted what, almost 950 or 1,000 years, and it's like that's a stretch to imagine today, even anything lasting for 1,000 years, let alone these time spans Cayce mentioned, you know, where, and you can't even say if exactly the Atlantean, you know, population was the same over this time period, because it's a multicultural empire centered in the mid-Atlantic. But the idea, let's say, of Atlantis, according to Cayce, is as old as 100,000 BC. And the first destruction, he gives a very specific date of 50,722 BC, which was a quite interesting date that, you know, he claims at that time, Atlantis was one of at least three, you know, global cultures that were all aware of each other, that had reached a point of quite high technology. We can deduce that because he bases the first destruction on the deployment of a directed energy weapon, is how he describes it, beamed from the stratosphere into volcanic rock openings in an attempt to destroy what he calls the animal menace that was overrunning the earth, which, if you think about it in mainstream science, what was running around 50,000 BC? The megafauna, giant bears, giant, you know, eagles, Haast's eagles, giant everything, carnivorous kangaroos in Australia, saber-toothed tigers, mastodons. And what's fascinating, Lynn, is that, would you believe that the Journal of Quaternary Sciences, which is a mainstream, you know, zoology journal, basically, they have 50,000 BC plus or minus a few hundred years listed as an unknown global extinction of megafaunal populations. And they even say, we cannot easily explain this. We must attribute it either to climactic factors or prehistoric hunting patterns, but it doesn't appear that that could have completed it on its own. So that's fascinating, because there you have mainstream science aligning with a very specific date. He didn't say 40,000. He didn't say 20,000. He said 50,722. Now, can I prove that? No, of course not, because how am I going to find evidence of a stratospheric energetic weapon, you know, 50,200 years later? I'm not. You know, these are still physical things that have to be built out of, you know, materials that are going to degrade. And I always tell people, you know, the only things that would last more than 10,000 years would be megalithic architecture, you know, things like the Great Pyramid of Giza, which again, Edgar Cayce puts at 10,490 BC as the start date for its construction.
So let's backtrack to the first cataclysm.
Mm-hmm.
According to Cayce, was caused by an attempt to get rid of all these enormous, dangerous animals that were making life difficult, but it sort of went wrong.
Yes. And what it did was, you know, at that point, he claims Atlantis was a enormous continent. Basically, if you start at Cuba and connect Cuba to the present mid-Atlantic ridge, which runs all the way up to Spain, you know, throughout the mid-Atlantic, it's still the largest mountain range in the world. It's just underwater. A lot of people forget that the Atlantic Ocean is divided in two by the largest mountain range in the world. And Cayce would say, well, that actually was Atlantis. And when sea levels were, you know, 600 to 1,000 feet lower and geographic conditions were much different, much of that was above water. So he would say that, you know, the continent fractured after this incident which he claims was a global decision. He refers to this in, I think, 8 readings, calls it the Great Congress, where leaders from all over the world said, look, we're all being overrun by these megafauna. We got to deal with it. And so that causes the fracture of the continent into 5 large islands that are still very close to each other and kind of crisscross with large river systems. The second destruction, again, human caused, which was 28,000 BC, roughly. And it's when the Tuaui crystal, or the Firestone, which was at that point, that many thousands of years later, a new power source, which was this extremely powerful technology that basically used collected solar and stellar energy and harnessed and stored it in the earth in kind of substations, and then kind of in a Tesla Wardenclyffe Tower type way, it broadcasted wireless energy to all the flying and submarine vessels that traversed in the air and the water in this time period. And he claims, he gave a reading to this guy. It's a funny reading. Could you imagine if you got this reading, Lynn? It was a guy from, I think, Oklahoma, whose aunt said, you got to go down there with Mr. Casey and get a reading. See who you were in a past life. So this guy, this is a true story. This guy goes down there and I want to know, I don't even believe in this, but I want to know. And it turned out that it was him under the name of Asal Sine in Atlantis, who was the lead engineer when the meltdown happened, because he said he overtuned the frequency of the crystal and it fractured the remaining 5 islands, destroyed 2, and 3 remained. And he called those Poseid, Arion, and Og. And I believe it's the island of Poseid, for numerous reasons, that Plato was referring to.
Right.
And that the story had degraded over so much time because it had been transmitted through the Atlanteans who went to Giza, and then through thousands of years to the dynastic Egyptians that told Solon in the year 560 BC. There's this thing called Atlantis, but that the details of it hadn't reached them, because it had been so long ago. So I think that was kind of my job, was like a forensic, crime scene investigator. Everybody's talking about this, but some people are coming at it from this perspective. Some people are coming at it from here, here, here. You've got weird extinctions that nobody can explain. You've got these very bizarre dates that this psychic man is throwing out. This man who's, by the way, I tell people, as in the book, let's look at some of the things Casey said that did come true, to kind of, before I even say his name again, because I can already imagine people say, well, how could you prove this? What did he actually do that's provable? Well, I'll tell you this much. In 1930, Edgar Casey discovered, through clairvoyance, an enormous underground buried river system that went from the Red Sea through Central Africa, and he claimed emptied into the Atlantic Ocean on the Congo end of the country many millennia ago, 12,000 plus years ago. Well, in 1986, Space Shuttle Imaging Radar finds that exact river system. And it empties into the Atlantic exactly where he said it was. Another thing he predicted were the exact players of World War II, almost a decade before the war started, which is interesting. He predicted the turning point of the Nazi war machine at the Battle of Kursk without being privy to information from Hitler's high command. How did he know this? So in real time, he was able to do the extraordinary, although he would just claim everybody can do this. It's just that I have a gift to attune myself to these Akashic records, as he called them. Which is interesting that he said Akashic, because that's a Sanskrit word, akasa, which means the ether or luminous or sky. So it's almost like,
that's to Atlantis, Michael. You know so much, and you're so interesting. But let's get back to Atlantis. That first continent literally included parts of what are now the east coast of the United States, correct?
Well, he would say the lowlands of Atlantis were the eastern seaboard of the United States.
So, and then it extended pretty far over toward Europe and
Right. Pretty much to where the Azores are today, all the way down to where Cuba is today.
Other land masses that we're familiar with weren't there. So there were things both rising and falling at the time of that first.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the United States was much reduced in landmass at that time, according to Casey. And, you know, even according to mainstream research, most of, you know, a huge part of Arizona was an inland sea at that time, which a lot of people don't think, but 12,000 years ago, most of Arizona was an inland sea.
So getting to the people of Atlantis, the readings tell us, they tell a story about the origin of humanity and the human body that we know now. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, that's a confusing subject, but, you know, Casey said basically that humanity went through multiple, you know, evolutions. He denied Darwinian evolution. He denied categorically that we just simply evolved from monkeys and that was the end of the story, even though we might incorporate, obviously, hominid, you know, components to our body. I don't think that's deniable. But I think it was much more complicated. You know, for him, it was, he gives a date, 10.5 million years ago. He claims some of the first souls came to Earth to experience this density, as he called it. And, you know, at that time, he claims the Earth's atmosphere was very different. It was much more, I guess, immaterial, the bodies that these people had. So they were material, but they could kind of, you know, shimmer in and out. It wasn't like they were fully what he called encased or entangled. And then as millions of years go by, they become kind of trapped, as he describes it, in materiality, some of them in trees, some of them in animals, which had already been evolving on the earth before these consciousnesses came there. And, you know, it's difficult because that's such a strange, you know, many people would claim anti-scientific idea, but, you know, that's what he said. And then
we were beings of light, like we were created in God's image, and God is spirit. God is not matter. So we were created like that, but we got curious about matter and started projecting ourselves into matter.
Exactly.
That's the story. We would probably do it all over again if we had the opportunity. Anyway,
yeah.
And then we kind of got stuck in matter,
right?
But not in bodies that were appropriate for a spiritual being.
Exactly. And so what happened was, he claims, you know, basically the first iteration of the Christ consciousness that would become Jesus many thousands of years later appeared, he claimed, you know, in Atlantis on Earth around 100,000 BC, and began this kind of purification process of the people to be better vehicles for, you know, the incoming souls throughout the years. And this is a theme that really kind of carries out throughout the whole Atlantean experience, from, let's say, 100,000 BC down to the final destruction and the aftermath, because by the end of it, the kind of psychotic, transhumanist, Sith, if you will, aspect of the culture that he called the Sons of Belial had enslaved some of these people, some of whom were remnants of these earlier, what he called entanglements. So it would have been a person with the hooves of a goat or facial features of a horse and the body of a man, which he says actually, you know, endure to this day in habits. So he's like, even though these beings don't exist per se, most of them were fixed or destroyed in the Egyptian experience in these two temples, which is another crazy side story. But he says they persist in habits. And, you know, I think that's absolutely true. I think we've all met people that look like birds, look like horses, I have a friend that looks like a goat, you know, when he grows his beard. And I don't think you should just absolutely deny these things. I look at Boris Johnson, I see a pig person, with a personality to match. So it's like, I think, he was onto something absolutely. And, what Casey said, though, is that basically as the density increased, some of these souls became deeply corrupted, because what started as like a fun experiment became this out of control thing where the passions of the beast started to take over. And then, as I mentioned, this other faction decided to enslave a lot of these people, for a variety of reasons, for pleasure, for fighting, for housework. And that the other faction, this is a strange reading, but I mean, he gave about 10 different readings on this battle of like, how do we incorporate these unfortunate beings into the society we're going to create in Egypt after the destruction of Atlantis. And so that becomes this kind of side arc of the human condition, was removing through surgery and all these arcane sound and light therapies, the feathers, the scales, the beaks, the claws from the parents. And he said it wouldn't work like, you just cut off a hand and put a human hand. But he says over many generations of these treatments to them and their children, using this extremely sophisticated, like Star Trek level technology within one of the pyramids, he says has still not been discovered. It's underground. They were able to create people that look, I guess, more like you and I, where we've lost a lot of our body hair and the scales, if we had them, or our beaks or something like that.
But you had mentioned the first incarnation of the Christ, the entity who would eventually become Jesus Christ.
Yes.
And he calls him Emilius. So it was his mission to basically create a body that would be appropriate for a spiritual being that we could grow spiritually in, right?
Right.
So
right. And Casey said that consciousness had been on Earth between Emilius and what he called the Nazarene, or the master, always 30 times,
right.
In variety of countries. So it's interesting because I think, it's also fascinating what he says about the Jesus figure himself, that how Mary, through preparation and training, not just through, the way I was taught at school, oh, the Holy Spirit came to her. And, in Casey's account, Mary was one of, 12 young girls who went to this basically Jedi academy of the Essenes, where they were all trained to be vessels for an incoming messianic consciousness. And
Right.
Mary was the best. She was the strongest. She was the most mature for her age, and she had like the purest personality. And actually, Casey said it wasn't that something came in. It was that she split herself through parthenogenesis and created this male version of herself, but that he and she were indistinguishable, which is interesting.
But again, we're jumping ahead now. We're jumping quite a bit ahead. So Emilius, the story from Casey is that Emilius projected into bodies, newly created bodies, in several, like 5 different places, to start the new human race that was going to be more or less the way we are now.
Yeah, I mean, there seems to be 5 simultaneous projections,
Right.
like the 5 races, the 5 colors, the 5 senses, as he says in the reading. And
Right.
each race represents a quality. So a quality, not equality, but I guess equality in terms of, they all originated from the same spark.
Right.
And it's interesting because he says, he's using the kind of 1930s language, so I don't mean to offend anybody, but he says, the red race, like the Native Americans of North America, were the Atlanteans primarily. The white race Carpathian Mountains, he claims, which is where we think it happened in mainstream science. The black race, he says, in Upper Sudan, the brown race in the Andes Mountains, and what he calls the yellow race, the Asian race, in the Gobi Desert. Well, at the time was not a desert, it was a fertile plain. So, and each of them possessed a unique quality. He says white people, it was vision. Asians was hearing. Black people was sensation and pleasure. The brown was mysticism. Or I'm sorry, the brown was, I forget what the brown was. It was touch or something related to touch. And then the red was mysticism. And that they all work together, that they represent a kind of complete planetary framework, for enjoying life.
And so one of these projections, I know that there's some controversy in the ARE as to whether Emilius actually split into 5 to project into these 5 different people, or whether Emilius was one of a group of people, that he was the leader of a group of people who projected
Right.
into these 5 different places. That's not exactly clear from the
No, it's not. I've always read it like the 5 projections were distinct from the Emilius character. Like they happened actually, might have even happened after he came, and I've looked for that answer for a long time, and you got to look through commentary on the KC readings, because he doesn't specifically say it. And I don't think anybody can put a date at when those races happened. I think, though, we can say it was before the first destruction. It seems like the races had already existed pre-50,000 BC. But I don't know.
One of those races, one of those projections was into Atlantis. And so
Yes.
we have a human body that's something pretty much like the one we have now. There were there were some minor tweaks or adjustments after the body was created, but pretty much
Right.
like the one we have now. And
Right.
so what was life like? What was life like for people who lived in Atlantis?
It's interesting, Lynn, because he only talks about the early stages of Atlantis like 3 or 4 times. Almost 90% of his readings deal with the final version, like from about 15,000 to 11,000 BC. So what was life like in 100,000 BC Atlantis? Well, he says, it was a lot simpler, but they were still working with, I can only go by what the readings say. I never make any guesses. So, for example, we know that from his readings, I don't know, but from his readings, we know that in 50,000 BC, roughly, when they deployed this stratospheric weapon, you would think, okay, this is extremely advanced technology, so they must be flying around in, metal flying craft like they later were, according to Frederick Oliver. No, Casey says they were actually flying around in Zeppelins, in this kind of like steampunk version of flight, where the Zeppelins actually, he said, they used the skin of dried elephants and other pachyderms and flew around in these strange things that moved with compressed air. Now, in the later versions, like the height of Atlantis, about 1,000 years before its decline, they were using aluminum cigar-shaped flying craft that could go underwater at rapid speed. So there was an evolution, because, you're talking 40,000 years difference. Think about how much flight has evolved in our own time, from the Graf Zeppelin to a rocket that can land, in Texas. So I think it's impossible to say with any certainty what life was like in those previous iterations. But I can say that in the 11,000 to 10,000 BC, we have a very clear picture from these 2 sources, Frederick Oliver and Edgar Casey, of what life was like on the ground. And really the clearest does come from A Dweller on Two Planets, because he walks through the whole city. It takes you to the university, takes you to the psychiatric hospital, takes you to the science, museum, and all these things. So it's quite fascinating, and even gives numbers of people that live there, how many millions and where the colonies were, because I think by the end of 11,000 BC, according to Frederick Oliver, and I would say according to research and what Casey said, the Atlanteans had colonized most of North America. They had colonized the Mediterranean up to Egypt, just like Plato said. And they had colonies in the Amazon as well. And that's why it's so confusing when people find these things all over the world that seem to be distinct to that culture. But if you put it in the bigger picture, you'll find that, just like the Aztecs said, look, we inherited a lot of these pyramids. We didn't build, Teotihuacan. We didn't build the Pyramid of the Sun. We used it, but we didn't build it. That comes from something much older. That starts to make sense.
Right. So in that later period that Casey did talk more about, so this is the final iteration of Atlantis, right?
Yeah.
What does he say about it? Well, you've made some reference to the Tuaui stone.
Yeah. Yeah. The Tuaui, I know that the Tuaui was present at least by the second destruction. I think they rebuilt it and it was still powering their civilization for the next 10,000 plus years. But Casey said basically it was this enormous six-sided crystal that was housed in an observatory, a stone observatory, very large, that had a retractable dome, and it could move like a lighthouse kind of. And it absorbed stellar energy collected in the crystal that was transferred to subterranean power reservoirs. And then the crystal itself could, like a lighthouse, project, or like much more accurately, like Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower, project wireless energy fields that these craft could entrain with. So you wouldn't even necessarily have to pilot the craft. It would project a flight plan to this place and kind of crisscross the sky with these, wirelessly powered craft that were all entrained to the crystal. And that the crystal could also light up your house. If you had a receiver for it, it could transfer heat, he said. It was very interesting how he talked about it could heat a room without physically, being near the room, just through entraining with the frequency of this crystal. And very fascinating. I think a lot of this technology probably, maybe in a few hundred years, we'll rediscover. But basically an ultra modern Star Wars type, amenities they had, flying machines, advanced submarines. In Frederick Oliver's account, they have essentially like blaster rifles. He calls them electric rifles. So you can use your imagination. It's quite interesting. And it's even more bizarre what he said, because he was writing in 1882, before airplanes even existed. So I find his reading particularly compelling, given that he was 17 years old.
Oliver was the author of Dweller on Two Planets,
right.
So the Tuaui stone was a source of energy for almost everything. It was also used for healing, I think. I think that Casey
did say that you could regenerate the body using that, but it could also be used for destruction, like a Death Star. It was this kind of neutral power that could be harnessed for good or, evil. And, this one faction, the Sons of Belial,
you're breaking up.
And
Hello?
Say again?
You were breaking up there. You seem to be back now.
Oh.
Okay. You were saying about
okay.
the Sons of Belial.
Yeah, they were always trying to get access to that technology to use for their wars.
So this is in the
things like this
part of Atlantean history. Things have gotten a little bit corrupted, and you've got two factions. You've got the Sons of Belial, and you've got
the Children of the Law of One.
Of the Law of One.
Yep,
and
that's right.
I'll talk about that.
Yeah, well, the Children of the Law of One, the closest analog would be like the Jedi. And again, this is all given before Star Wars. This is 40 years before the franchise was created. So I find that very interesting. But yeah, the Children of the Law of One were basically spiritually, they weren't perfect. I mean, many of them, if you read all the readings, they're quite corrupted by the Sons of Belial. Some of the priestesses, do some pretty wild things, because they're human beings. They're not perfect. But their main philosophy was that they sought peace and they sought a deeper understanding of nature, philosophy, things like this. Whereas the sons of Belial were much more interested with pushing the extremes of material science through genetic manipulation of other humans, through kind of nasty manipulation of technology, propaganda, hedonism, wild parties, and a totalitarian type bent to it, which eventually, Casey said, there was a war, in the final iterations. Whether the war precipitated the final destruction or a natural disaster, he doesn't say. That's the only destruction, strangely, he doesn't ever describe, and neither does Plato. Plato never gives you a clue. The only clue Plato gives you, which I think is very revealing, is the fact that the Egyptian priest says, you Greeks have the myth of Phaeton, who, lost control of his father's chariot and fell to earth and burned everything up. But that's not a myth. That really signifies when a comet or asteroid or series of fragments from the toroid asteroid belt probably fell and destroyed Earth right at the same time that mainstream history says our current Holocene period begins. And I always want to remind people that you could say whatever you want, but if Plato was making this up, how did he know when the Ice Age ended, when he was writing in 360 BC? And how did he know that a comet caused that, when modern researchers like Dr. James Kennett and many others now are starting to realize, yeah, you know what? It's very likely we passed through a part of the asteroid belt and many comet fragments hit the Earth and destroyed whatever was upon it. So I think this is not something that we can just say is an allegory or a fairy tale anymore. I think the evidence is mounting, particularly with modern discoveries that push that date back to something that we can wrap our minds around. Because now, 20 years ago, you could say, well, find me an object that's 20 or 10,000 years old. Well, you can say Göbekli Tepe. It's very obvious that that was not created by hunter-gatherers. So, Gunung Padang in the West Java pyramid, probably 20,000 years old. How do you explain that? So these dates kind of line up with these time periods that we're talking about.
So we have this struggle between the children of the law of one and the sons of Belial.
Yeah, Belial. Yeah, Belial. That's right.
Who I think later was Baal, right?
Yes.
The Bible.
Right. And Belial too.
Right.
Interchangeable. Yeah, that's right.
Right. And as you were referencing, the sons of Belial wanted to keep these sort of semi-human beings as sort of like slaves.
Yes.
And the people, the children of the law of one, who, as you pointed out, weren't perfect, but they were definitely better. Definitely.
Yeah.
They wanted to try to raise the consciousness of these other beings, this third class of beings, and
right.
kind of bring them up to a more human level. So that was part of the conflict.
Yeah, that was a big part of the conflict in the third iteration of Atlantis, and it was a central point of the conflict in the Atlantis exodus and reboot in Giza, which Casey has a whole series of readings on that, which he says started in 10,500 BC. So before the final destruction, groups of people over hundreds of years started to go to the Pyrenees Mountains, where the Basque country is today with their inexplicably non-Indo-European language, the Yucatan, and Giza. And he says, but it was Giza that most of his clients who were visiting him were present in that experience. And Casey himself was present in that experience as an exiled priest named Rata from the Caucasus Mountains, who himself was working with Atlanteans coming in, bringing their technology, who were working with the native Egyptians and this invading group led by Edgar Casey 10,500 years ago from the Caucasus Mountains. And so you got this multicultural, few centuries before the end of the last ice age kind of attempt to create a new colony, because these people were aware that through astrological divination or whatever, that Atlantis was going to fall. And so they started to preserve records and then build the pyramid. And in the process, build these healing centers to surgically, he says, alter. And it's funny because a woman asked him many, many times in this reading, you could tell the source was getting annoyed. How did they do it though, Mr. Casey? You're being very vague. And he's like, surgery, and it's all caps. So he was yelling, surgery. He's like, as you would remove a wart, we would remove a scale or a feather or beak, So let that be very clear. Like, this wasn't some mystical thing. It was just using a rarefied type of, surgery and technology and some sort of sound therapy, he said, to genetically modify these mutants, or things as he called them.
Yeah. So you made some reference to the records that when the Atlanteans knew that Atlantis was likely to be destroyed,
Mm-hmm.
some of them set up these colonies in specific places and
Right.
hid records or placed records that later generations could find to learn the story of Atlantis, to learn everything that happened.
That's right.
A little bit.
Sure. Yeah, the jury's still out, where are they? Casey said
places that Casey talked about.
Yeah, Casey said, basically there's one reading that it's kind of open to interpretation based on a semicolon, but I think I kind of have an idea what he was saying. But we know for sure he specifically said one was in a separate pyramid that's underground between where the Nile River used to be and the right paw of the Sphinx would be the main Hall of Records. Although he claimed they're all similar. They're all copies of the same records. And the other would be in the Yucatan, under the shadow of a temple. Many people have searched for that. Some people think it's in, the Temple of Uxmal or in Piedras Negras, places like this. And the third, it's not clear, because I would even say there are four, technically, if you look at that reading. One, he says, is in a temple that was destroyed, but could rise again near Bimini in the Bahamas, where I'm going for my 40th birthday this July, going to the Fountain of Youth. Maybe I'll find it. But also, he also mentions, I think, some other unknown location in the heart of the Atlantean Empire, which could be, I would argue, the Azores, the mainland mass that used to be Poseidon. But it's not clear. I know for sure you could say the Yucatan and the Sphinx, and at least a temple that he says is sunken off Bimini Bank in Bahamas. And, he says it's a record of the first incarnations of humanity to the time of the final destruction in 10,500, 10,300 BC. And he says within that is, proof. But you're not going to be able to enter, he claimed, the Hall of Records under the Sphinx until humanity's consciousness has reached a point where what he claimed were the guards that were placed there will permit you to pass, which I believe would be some sort of android, perhaps, or some sort of technology, or maybe an electrostatic barrier that's entrained to, I don't know, heart magnetic rates or things like this that could actually measure if a person's not ready consciously to move into that space without dying. I don't know. He's very vague on that. But he did say guards were placed in the Sphinx area Hall of Records. So,
well, it's odd how the circumstances have prevented. I mean, they've used ground penetrating radar, and they do think that there's something under the paw of the Sphinx.
oh yeah,
I think it's the Egyptian government hasn't allowed anybody to actually dig down there. So it's
right.
sort of the circumstances have, for the time being, conspired to prevent that from happening. And I guess that means we're not ready for that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I look at the world today, I don't think we're ready for that. And it's going to take probably a lot more effort on the part of, humanity to be ready to use some of this technology, because one of the things Casey said was within these records are instructions on how to construct a, Tuaui crystal. So I'm not so sure that would be a good idea in 2024.
Well, it would be good in terms of our climate change issues, but it would not be so great in terms of the possible destructive uses of the stone.
Yeah. Yeah, I would feel a lot safer if we didn't. Although, I would argue that we probably already have scalar weapons from reverse engineered extraterrestrial technology going back to the 70s from declassified records. That's probably as powerful, scalar, you know, technology, which basically was the cause of the first destruction. Casey didn't have the technical language to use that term, but that's basically what he's describing when he says the death ray. Many people have tried to figure out what that weapon was. And it's cool because I put in the book a NASA scientist, a NASA physicist, who took the Casey reading on the Tuaui and made a very compelling case of exactly how it worked. And he's like, this makes perfect sense. This is why it had to have 6 sides. This is where the incident beam would have come in. This is why it was called the Firestone, because the amount of heat it would have generated with the specs Casey gave. And so that's kind of what I tried to do in the book is, look, I'm as skeptical as anybody. I don't believe anything I read without intuitively and investigatively looking at it and saying like, because not all channelers are created equal. That's why I was very kind of hesitant with the ones I chose. I chose the earliest people that have ever talked about this subject. Frederick Oliver, to my knowledge, is the first person on planet Earth to ever mention high technology in Atlantis. And that's significant because anybody today could say, I channeled a vision of a spaceship in Atlantis, because we've all been exposed to movies, books, and these ideas. But I wanted to see at a time that half of this technology didn't exist, who was talking about it. And that led me to Frederick Oliver and Edgar Casey and others like Rudolf Steiner and people like that.
Getting back to the survivors from Atlantis, the exodus from Atlantis.
Mm.
Here in North America, I believe the Iroquois, according to Casey,
Yes,
some of the Iroquois, their ancestors were Atlanteans.
that's right. Yeah, Casey said that those are the pure descendants of Atlantis. Because remember, in the first division of the races or projection of the 5 races, he says the red race, which the Iroquois in his parlance would have belonged to, projected into Atlantis. So that the true home of the Native Americans is not North America, it's Atlantis. And of course, they migrated because it's so close at that time, and you could just, hop across a small channel to get to the lowlands of the eastern seaboard. So naturally, they would have already settled there. And that explains so much, Lynn, because they're always pushing back that date. When I was a kid in school, it was, the Bering Strait, and that's the story. But now we know that's not possibly true for all of them. It's true for some of them. But not all Native Americans could have gotten across the Bering Strait, because they're finding skeletons in Guatemala and places that are 16, 13, 18,000 years old that don't even look like the Native Americans that crossed from Siberia, let's say. And they've had to admit in mainstream science that couldn't be the case. So I think, these much older migration patterns actually explain a lot of this confusion. I think we've gotten such a simplified version of Bering Strait, and then nothing happened, and then Columbus. That's it, which is absurd.
Right. Even mainstream science has kind of retreated from that. Yeah, but that's how
Right.
that's what we were taught when I was a kid in school, pretty much. And then
I was too.
They started to talk about the Vikings, and now
Right.
they're talking about the Clovis people, but they keep, as you say, they keep finding older and older evidence of human habitation in the Americas. So yeah,
That's right. Yeah, and Casey said that it was a combination. Like he was asked one time in this very long reading, since you asked about the Americas, describe like the history of Mexico and Central America in this time. And it's a fascinating reading. He's like, you had the people from Lemuria coming in, you had the people from Peru coming in, you had the people from Atlantis coming in, you had a mixture of all these peoples, so people think Mexico and South America and Central America are recently mixed societies because of pure indigenous people and Spanish conquistadors. But according to Casey, it's like this has been a mixing point for 20,000 plus years. So it's like these terms we use today are kind of, I mean, they almost have legal implications too, because it's like we're all from some place that was not our original home. So are the Iroquois truly indigenous to whatever state? I forget, we claim that that's their homeland. It's like, no, their homeland's at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. This is where they came, Are the Egyptians purely, Arabic people, or are they descendants of the red race mixed with the Atlanteans and people from the Carpathian Mountains? Yeah, go ahead.
Michael, we're going to have to kind of wind down here. So
Sure.
It's been a lot of fun. Now, how would people find out more information about this, about you, and about your book? And tell us about your website.
Oh, sure. Yeah, my website is just Michael or Flem, one word, my last name, .com. If you want to send him a message.
Leflem, Flem.
Yeah, michaelleflem.com. And you could send me a message on there if you have a question or anything. And if you'd like to buy the book, you could just go on Amazon. And it's also available in Kindle audiobook. It's available in Spanish. I translated it. So yeah, if you want, any more information, like I said, my website is a great source because I also link to a lot of Casey lectures and other sources. It's not just to promote my own book. I show you where I got a lot of my material because I think it's a joint effort. It's always interesting to see what other people find because I think in a weird sense we're all interested in this crazy story from the distant past.
Well, it sounds like a crazy story from the distant past, but it also sounds like we're kind of reliving parts of it right now.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. 100% we are. 100%.
The sons of Belial and the children of one are still struggling.
They're out there.
That way to me.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Of course. Of course. It's pretty clear, I think. Yeah, sure. Absolutely. It's the same thing. It's like the Bible says, well, yeah, Ecclesiastes 1:9, there's nothing new under the sun. That's the truest thing you could say about that book, is that line is the truth. The history is very, I think, informative. And if you don't learn, it's a cyclical thing. Some things are unavoidable. Maybe we are going to face a catastrophe similar to that. Better to be aware of the limitations of humanity rather than the hubris of what we could achieve. I think it's better to look at things like, hey, we did a lot more and we still failed. Maybe we should focus on, more positive things instead of congratulating ourselves on how far we've come when even the greatest civilizations like Atlantis have fallen.
Well, that's a kind of a good stopping place, I think, maybe. So thank you, Michael. I really enjoyed talking to you, and
Thank you.
Maybe we can have another conversation again because it seems like you can go off in a lot of different directions with information on a lot of different things. So
yeah, well, that's just how I've always been. I don't know. Maybe I have ADD or something, but that's just how I guess my mind works. But thank you for reining me in because you're right. I will get out of control. And thank you, Hercules, for the invite. I know you were behind the scenes there for the whole thing, so I hope you had a good time. But thank you both. I really appreciate it. And more than anything, I think it's so cool that there's people out there that, know the Casey work and know the readings better than me for longer than me. And I think it's something that a lot of more people, especially younger people, should be aware of, because he was a very special person who has, I think, a lot to tell us about the world today, particularly.
Thank you very much to both of you for a very informative and engaging hour. I want to read your book now. And yes, I think a part two would be great, Lynn, if we can arrange it. And I have so much I could share with you about the Amanasa or the things, because I've researched that direction. So that'll wait for next time too.
Wow. I would really appreciate whatever you do have. Maybe you could email me, because that's a really weird, interesting topic of mine.
Briefly, I'll give you a couple of sentences. When I was growing up, whenever I went to Greece, there the doctors on the islands, they would see humans and animals, and they were pretty much veterinarians as well as doctors, and they had all these spiritual practitioners as well. And the doctors would tell you that these creatures from mythology are still being born. They call them terata, which means monsters, and they each had lots of.
Wow.
And I've spoken to people here in this country I'm in my 60s now, back when I was in my 20s, who had medical educations in Greece, and they had stories of the terata, and they said that they saw pictures of them if they didn't experience them directly.
Really?
And also,
Wow.
there are a lot of people who claim to be these creatures incarnating in the human life stream. If you research
Wow.
other kin, you'll find a lot of the literature over there.
That's so funny, Hercules, because I have a whole subchapter on otherkin in that
Okay.
book. So that's so funny you said that. But I had never heard that account from the Greek doctors of, wow.
Yeah, I don't know
Wow.
if you're saying that now. This was, again, I'm in my 60s. This is from 40, 50 years ago,
Wow.
these conversations. But thank you so very much to both of you. This was an awesome hour. And thanks to our listeners. This should be up on YouTube by tomorrow, early in the day. And I'll send you links, and I'll link
All right.
on Amazon and your website.
All right. Thank you so much. Take care.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.